Thank you so much, Kim. Welcome, everybody. I want to start off by saying how terrifically excited I am, and of course, with the land acknowledgement. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, cities on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders. We also stand with Black Lives Matter and any forms of discrimination against Asian and Pacific Islander communities. Every year, the VCS program and QCC collaborate to program the series Queer Conversations on Culture and the Arts. Queer Conversations on Culture and the Arts brings together locally, nationally, and globally renowned artists, writers, filmmakers, and scholars for a series of conversations to discuss a broad range of LGBTQ+ topics in the humanities, architecture, design, and the arts. CCA Humanities and Sciences Dean Titi Takamoto, me, Kim Anno, Christine Wang, and I thank CCA's Provost Office led by Tammy Ray Carlin, as does our colleague Josh Foth, Textile Program Chairs. We also thank the Queer Cultural Center of San Francisco, led by Executive Director Natalia Vigil, who generously funded Diedrick's talk and his conversation with Danielle Jackson that is forthcoming. As I said, our partners in tonight's endeavor on, I always like to say the date, March 16th, 2021, are the programs in textiles and painting and drawing and the fine arts division. Together, we join in the celebration of 50 years of ethnic studies here at CCA. Congratulations to the Critical Ethnic Studies Program Chair, Shyla Pacheco-Hamilton, all our faculty colleagues, the alumni, students, and staff of this storied program. Tonight's program, an artist talk by CCA alum Diedrick Brackens, graduate Fine Arts class of 2014, will be followed by a conversation with CCA VCS and curatorial practice alum Danielle A. Jackson. It's my honor to introduce Danielle A. Jackson, who earned her MA in curatorial practice and an MA in VCS in 2015. Danielle also holds a BA in art history and sculpture from Illinois State University in Bloomington. Danielle A. Jackson is a writer. Her MA thesis in VCS followed her research on choreographer Ralph Lemon and multidisciplinary artist Dred Scott, and their experimental invocations of US civil rights history in their respective practices. Subsequently, she co-edited the first monograph on Ralph Lemon for the Museum of Modern Art's Modern Dance book series. She is also the editor of Living Collections catalog, Creative Black Music, a dynamic online publication highlighting the history of Black experimental music at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis. Forthcoming is a piece on the work of her good friend Diedrick for the catalog to accompany his upcoming exhibition at the New Museum in New York. Danielle A. Jackson is also an interlocutor. Among her past conversational partners and interview subjects for public programs and contemporary events are artists Adam Pendleton, William Pope L., E.J. Hill, Stephanie Jemison, choreographer Will Rawls, curator Stuart Comer and Adrian Edwards, and writer and cultural critic Lynn Tillman. Danielle is also a curator, currently a curatorial assistant at MoMA in New York. She has worked on the acclaimed exhibitions Member Pope L, 1978 through 2001, and Adam Pendleton, Who is Queen? While she was still here in San Francisco, she was part of the curatorial team for the performance exhibition Radical Presence, Black Performances in Contemporary Art at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. As the Interdisciplinary Arts Fellow at the Walker Arts Center from 2016 to 2018, she curated and produced an off-site performance and film by artist Theaster Gates and worked on the exhibition Jason Moran. Danielle is also a researcher. In addition to the aforementioned publications and curatorial projects she has collaborated on, she has lectured on Howardina Pindell, published on Senga Ngudi, and researched the careers of Jacoby Satterwhite, Mark Bradford, Neil Belufa, and Adrian Piper for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. As you can figure out, Danielle Jackson is pretty busy. So we're really glad that she can join Diedrick in this conversation after his artist talk. And I'll turn it over to Josh to introduce Diedrick. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Kim. Good evening, and many thanks for joining us for tonight's very special lecture and conversation with Diedrick Brackens and Danielle Jackson. I'm Josh Fott, a faculty member within the Fine Arts Division here at the California College of the Arts. I'd also like to thank CCA Humanities and Sciences Dean Titi Takamoto, VCS Chair Jacqueline Francis, Kimano, Christine Wang, CCA's Provost Office led by Tammy Ray Carlin, and QCC led by Executive Director Natalia Vigil, for your collective generosity funding tonight's program. Brings me great pleasure to introduce Diedrick Brackens. Brackens is a Texas-born, Los Angeles-based artist who draws from a variety of textile traditions. Historical antecedents culled from European pictorial tapestry, West African strip weaving, and quilts of the American South are often woven together to produce graphic meditations on queer Black subjectivity, intimacy, and folklore. Because I think of him so much more as a colleague and friend, it's strange to think that I first met Brackens when he was a graduate student within the MFA program at CCA from 2013 to 2015. From the start, I was compelled by Brackens' tenaciously inquisitive work, the fluid ways in which it so urgently oscillates between narrative confession, figuration, and an embrace of geopolitical textile abstraction. Drawing from the writing of such celebrated poets as Essex Hemphill, Brackens' lyrical woven strategies center on a defiant embrace of love, contextualized within the backdrop of America's continued history of racialized violence and labor. This love manifests in his relationship with material, the technical virtuosity he brings to his process, the tenderness with which he choreographs the personas in his compositions, and the emotional generosity he extends to his audiences. Since his graduation from CCA, Brackens has exhibited his work extensively to an international audience. Brackens has produced solo exhibitions at such venues as the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas, Oakville Galleries at Centennial Square in Toronto, the New Museum in New York, as well as Jack Shaman Gallery, New York, and various small fires, Los Angeles, where he's co-represented. Brackens' work was also recently featured at the Hammer Museum as part of the 2018 Made in LA exhibition. Brackens' work is included in the permanent collections of the Hammer Museum Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and the Studio Museum Harlem, among others. His work has been featured in such prominent publications as Art in America, the New York Times, and Vogue. He's also been the recipient of numerous prizes and awards, including the Joyce Alexander Wien Prize in 2018, the Marciano Artadia Award in 2019, the Louis Comfort Tiffany Award in 2019, the American Craft Council Emerging Voices Award in 2019, and most recently, the United States Artist Fellowship in 2021. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Diedrick Brackens.
Thank y'all. Hello, hello, hello. It's so good to see y'all and kind of sort of be there and all these familiar faces. Thank you, Josh. That was beautiful. And I'm so excited to talk to Danielle. I mean, I talk to Danielle all the time. One of my best friends. We met at CCA, so it feels great to have this kind of homecoming. So I guess I will pull up my well, I mean, here's Danielle and I, right after we graduated, on a trip to New York, seeing art, doing the thing. And that's not what I want to share. Here it is. Oh God, I don't know how to work this thing. Okay, so I really wanted to do something that I have stopped doing and share work that I was making while I was in grad school. and talk about how that's kind of led me to be where I am. So it's fun also to share these things because like Danielle was there and in my studio and talking with me through things, as well as many of the professors on the line. So it's maybe like the greatest hits of or failures of the time. But I really started at that time exploring poetry and thinking about its relationship to my work. And as Josh was saying, Essex Hemphill was a really big influence on the ways that I was starting to articulate visually what was going on in my work. Waiting on His Balcony is kind of a truncation of a poem by Essex Hemphill where he reimagines Rapunzel as a Black queer man. And so I really started to use materials to try to think through some of these ideas that he was putting forth that so strongly resonated with me. And as I started to work out how to sort of start to articulate queerness in my practice, I think I was also still thinking a lot about my Southernness and being raised as a Southern Baptist and having all of these kinds of stories and cultural things that I was carrying with me and trying to find a way to let those things sit together. So something that I heard my whole life was that you never bring an old broom to a new house. And so it was a military brat. We moved a lot. We were always like throwing out like cleaning utensils and getting new ones every time we moved. And then there's this idea in African American culture about jumping the broom as this kind of holdover to celebrate marriage from times of enslavement. And I started thinking about this tool, these stories that sort of felt like they didn't have space for me in them as a Black queer man, and how to kind of reckon with that. So I started to break and remake these brooms, and yeah, it was a good time. And one of the final pieces I made in grad school was the Unicorn Kente, where I started to combine a lot of these weaving traditions that I was aware of, learned about, looked at, seen objects made through. And a lot of these were West African strip weaving was one of them, European tapestries, these medieval, often Flemish tapestries, and leaving something out, American quilting was the other reference point. So I started to try to combine these techniques and the spirit and energy of them to make objects myself. And I thought that if I was using language, like employing all these textile languages in one object, I could start to articulate sort of this uniquely kind of American perspective of having all these kind of cultures come together. And one of the first ones that I made was this weaving, where I was thinking about the unicorn tapestries, which I was so in love with, and trying to find a way to make that thing a self-portrait by kind of taking the unicorn and making it white, abstracting a lot of the imagery in the field. And yeah, this was the kind of resulting object. So I graduated in 2014 and had an exhibition that next year at Johansson Projects in Oakland. And I think a lot of it was just having conversations, being around, and entering into like an agreement with Kimberly to do a show almost a year right after having graduated. So I moved to Oregon, which sounds weird to say, but I was teaching at the University of Oregon for a year, and this was it's like isolating. It was one of the first experiences, really like picking up, moving somewhere, and starting completely over without any scaffolding. And while I was there, this was right around the time that cases of police brutality and the sort of extrajudicial killings of Black folks was getting a lot of media attention. So you would log on to Facebook or Instagram, and there would be these kind of autoplay videos of these murders kind of on repeat. And so I think I was seeing all these things, and that started to follow me into the studio. So I was making a lot of work where I was trying to, through abstraction, talk about these really horrible instances of violence against Black bodies. And I wanted to, as much as I wanted to engage, I didn't want to sort of replicate what kind of the violence of like watching those images or seeing those bodies in that state. So 1079 is a police code that often meant to call the coroner. And so I was interested to like use that language to meditate on what was the it's hard to keep the names together in the moments in time. That was Mike Brown's killing in Ferguson, and um, Eric Garner, whose sort of last words became famous, the "I can't breathe." So it's using bleach in a way to sort of think about this, the causticness of the removal of these bodies from the world, from their lives, and as a kind of drawing tool on the surfaces of these weavings. This is a little out of order, but other works that I had been doing around that time was I started to think about quilt codes and the patterns of quilts, and wanting to incorporate more intentionally this reference point that was so important to me in the work. So I started making these weavings and arranging them in these quilt patterns so that this follows the logic of the log cabin quilt, but in this kind of woven format, or almost like a fire hose or a labyrinth. And I think started to think about what sort of ways that the textiles I was making could honor these historical textiles that came before, but start to inject this new aesthetic and language and use of color and material. So Holy, 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 I made in grad school. It was the first object that I made and really was like, I made a piece of art, and no matter who comes into my studio, I'm gonna feel good about it. Because I think there's a lot of times in grad school, you're like, what am I doing? I'm making a mess, and it's gonna be torn down by 6 different like opinions and voices. But I felt like I knew what was happening in the work. I was inhabiting the work. It felt like it was me, and I like still return to this work so often, thinking about that. And so much of what was going on that sort of provoked me to make it was I was looking at the time there was this bill in Uganda that was being funded by and supported by American politicians and uh, Christians, and they were helping to write legislation that, if passed, would allow for essentially human rights violations against queer people in Uganda. And so it was horrifying in and of itself, but to me, to think about Americans supporting atrocity in this way to folks who sort of I shared this kind of racial and queer identification. It was just like, oh, I don't know how to reconcile this. So I started really using these techniques that I was pulling from all of these different reference points to think about how, in this literal way, that like these markers of Blackness and queerness aren't, you can't extricate one for the sake of the other, that these things are sort of intertwined, which I think was a lot of the conversation at the time, and one that I'd heard mimicked in the American context, that like one of these things is not like the other, which, as I live and breathe, and as this textile like holds itself together. So I was meditating on this idea of um, wholes, of the spiritual, the idea of whole or holy, and what it means to kind of be fully integrated. And I think I extrapolated from that work and started to return to think about this American context. This was again in the show that was at Johansson Projects called This Is Real Life, and starting to make these large scale works that borrowed all of these techniques and traditions and modes to make these textiles that I think at the time were really pulling.
James, this is Jackie. I'm so sorry. I'm being held up.
Can we hear me? Maybe.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't know what I'm telling y'all. It was pulling together this kind of language from the urban environment, using these kind of high key, high contrast colors against this muted palette, to think at that time about the ways that I was experiencing the world and how it was mediated by a threat of death and violence, and being afraid that any encounter with at that moment law enforcement or some vigilante could end in like death or violence, and was for so many folks. And so trying to reconcile this idea of Americana and the kind of sweet, lovely images it invokes against this this other image that folks are having or experiencing of America. And it's the only untitled work I have in my life, and it bothers me. So I think about that a lot. Come on. And so I have a lot of these abstractions in the early work because I'm really interested to sort of think about how the spirit of the work has never changed, even if the mode of legibility has. And so early in the work, I was really interested in making what I think of as portraiture or dedications to folks. So that this particular work was for a lover that I had at the time, where I was using these materials like wine to conjure this kind of romantic dimension, thinking about California in particular, and how what its relationship to that material is, and how it's kind of where I came of age and was even introduced to what wine is or should taste like or shouldn't taste like, and all of these things are sort of embedded in this work, whereas in other works I was using these same materials to think about blood and about violence. So I think I was always interested in bringing what is happening in my life in a holistic way into the work, so that there are these dimensions of kind of love and romance and just the world that I'm seeing outside, along with these sort of darker truths and realities. So I started making bandages. I was weaving almost trompe-l'oeil band-aids in grad school, and I got to this place where I was like, I spent all this time on this thing. It looks like the thing. It's true to form in this way that I was excited about. And I remember I'd made a couple of them, and I got to this place where um, probably Josh, honestly, was like, do you have to, like, does it have to look like the thing? Can you just like buy Band-Aids and stick them on a wall? And I remember being like, because I was so dedicated to like weaving and the materiality and all the things. And I just was like, I can't even entertain this. But I also was like, it's a lot of labor to like make this thing look like the thing. And later I returned back to the Band-Aid, abstracted it a bit and like changed scale and all these things. And I was like, okay, like I get what he was saying. Like there's some merit in this. But I think there's so much about textiles and their relationship to healing that is like this important component for me in the work. And I think I'm always trying to access something to speak to that. And at this time, using the Band-Aids, I was really trying to move towards this other etymological link that textiles have to healing. So there's a word in Old English, clotho, there's a word and it means a poultice. So there's this, and then that word becomes cloth at a certain point. And I think often textile folks pull towards texere, which is a Greek word, Latin word, one of those, which means to weave and to write. So there's this like link to language that people pull towards, and I think I'm more interested in that healing dimension often. And so I started making these Band-Aids to sort of meditate on that idea. And I was thinking about the kind of color on the part that would be the gauze or the that pad where the blood goes as a space to think about blood and about stains, about the body, or about the textile and the flicker between this Band-Aid being a body or a bandage. And then you can see there's a dedication to Martel and one. And I was using tea to dye those kind of pink tan parts. Am I going backwards? Their landscape really didn't show up in my work, I don't think, until I moved to Oregon. But there's a lot of it, landscape that is there. And I think it was moving to the West Coast was the first time that I lived as much of my life outside as I did indoors. Like growing up in Texas, it wasn't that the landscape wasn't there, it just, I don't know, you go, the time of landscape is from your car door to your house door, wherever you're going. And it was fascinating and beautiful, but I think there were times where I was just overwhelmed by it and also frightened, thinking about like the things that could happen to one outdoors in nature, the threat of other folks, not let alone just the environment itself. And so I think I spent a lot of time looking at it and trying to be in relationship to it or communion with it, but there always felt like there was this scrim between me and it, and like really deriving pleasure from it. I think these are okay. That's a big jump in time, but I wanted to show a lot of these early works to think about sort of what was happening then and some of the ways that stuff has kind of held sway in the work now. And in The Decadence of Silence is this work from 2018 that was in a show at the Hammer Museum made in LA. And it was really one of the first huge platforms I had to share the work. And I recently started this return to figuration, or this sort of legibility of the body. And I was really relying on these folk tales and biblical stories and real life events, and starting to try to mythologize them in a sense, or create some allegory to um, think about what work that I feel is related to the art form of tapestry, although not the technical. What would a tapestry look like and talk about in this moment, as opposed to um, the 15th century? And so there are these elements, I think, that hold sway still, are the idea of the hunt and using animals to think about our own characteristics, or the things that we want to um, raise up about ourselves. Um, so the catfish is this thing, this creature that shows up in my work, even when I'm like, no catfish for a while. I'm like, I've got some ideas for a catfish. I think of them as my spirit animal. There's this relationship for me of um, them being these specifically and uniquely Southern creatures, them having all these negative associations kind of piled onto them in ways that history, the media has done also to Black bodies and people. And I think for me, I'm trying to create this loop between uh, both of these ideas. And I think to depict something is to give it some amount of love and attention and respect. And I think to raise it up is this gesture of its own redemption, as it is to mine, to like identify with this creature. And there's this relationship between them in life and death, the depths and the shallows, and mud and sustenance. So like the idea of someone eating this thing, kind of bring it into themselves, to think of it as this spirit or ancestral creature. I think that there's this perfectly beautiful kind of closed loop between it and myself. So I really kind of revere it. And so this work and the previous work were in a show in Los Angeles at my my LA gallery, Various Small Fires, that took inspiration from a poem by Essex Hemphill called Father, Sons, and Unholy Ghost. And the name of the show was Unholy Ghosts. And the poem really thinks about Essex relationship to masculinity, and extends this idea of this kind of doubling that happens, or tripling, of a brother, a lover, a father, and a son. And I think the way that I've always read it is that there's this intense interest to understand and access something in relationship to masculinity, and trying to break down some of the barriers that prevent men from tenderness, from just sharing things with each other. And I mean, I would also extend it to say perpetuating violence against themselves and other folks, and many other conversations that I think we all are interested in and have. And I think one of the things he says is that if you sort of start to heal one of those relationships, that it's sort of like a domino. So if you were to, for instance, heal a relationship with your father, it like impacts your relationship with the lover or your brother. And so I was interested in articulating that in these weavings. An American wedding is a weaving that bears the name of I feel like a broken record, a poem by Essex Hemphill. And it was in an exhibition at the New Museum in 2019. And it was the one work that was commissioned for the show, the rest were brought together from a series of weavings I'd done over about the last 3 years. And they start to create this narrative of really like exploring the kind of tender and these ideas of love between these two bodies that are often in the weavings, or the human and the animal figure that might be present. And I started to bring the weavings into space and away from the wall into these forms that sort of mimic tapestry looms. And I think being able to see and navigate around all sides really allows the viewer, whether or not they can go back home and make one, to understand the construction in ways that you don't when you just see the one face of the work. I mean, I think the one thing I'll say about this work is that I came to this place where I started to see water as almost another actor in a lot of the works that I was making, both that they were this carrier for the catfish. I think often about Black folks in their relationship to water and how fraught it is. I think one of the things that I am fixated on, both in my work and in just the popular imagination, is drowning, and my anxiety about drowning and about being drowned, and not necessarily me, but Black folks. And so this particular piece was thinking about this kind of symbiosis between body and water, the two figures and the kind of background on left and right, or I think about the water kind of in this embrace with these figures and this dance, as opposed to being in peril in the water. So not last year, in 2019 and 2020, I started making this series of works for my New York gallery, Jack Shaman, for my first show there that was to open last April. And obviously that did not happen due to COVID, but I was able to bring the work in the way that I conceived it to hang in that space to an exhibition hall in Oakville, Ontario, called Oakville Galleries. And so it's on view right now alongside a show or exhibition of Sangan Ngudi, and which I'm pumped to have a show in any context with Sangan Ngudi, because I think of her as such a role model, icon. But I was really meditating on this CDC statistic that came out in 2016 that says, to use their language, within their lifetimes, 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men would contract HIV. And this was in comparison to 1 in 6 for the general population and 1 in 11 for white men. And I think that is not easy to reconcile and to understand or articulate feelings about when you think about the ways that HIV and AIDS has been thought about in the moment that we live now versus sort of 40 years ago. And so all the weavings in the show and all the figures in the weavings, half of them have some sort of jewel or charm or button or something on the surface to sort of stand in for the virus. And then they all are engaged in these sort of ritual type poses, thinking about the kinds of things that I have known and seen and thought about people and know that people do when they are ailing, and how we deal with any sort of disease. And I think even those of us who are not spiritual have, you form some sort of ritual. You do something to be well, whether that is on a physical level, a mental level, emotional level, all of these things. Yeah, and the other exhibition that's on view right now is at the Scottsdale Museum of Art, which I was fortunate to work with Lauren O'Connell, who is another CCA grad from Danielle's cohort, who is curator there. And we've been talking for a few years about creating an exhibition together. And we finally had this opportunity to bring Arc of Bulrushes there, and it is on view until the late summer, I think, in case you find yourself in Scottsdale, Arizona. So here's just an installation view of the show. I really started to work with quilt patterns to think about the story and contested history of using quilts to navigate the Underground Railroad. And I used that information sort of as a jumping off point to imagine how textiles could be used or encoded with meaning and used as liberatory devices, and then started to think about like what other textile techniques could be exploited to be used as a form of self-liberation, of navigation, to extrapolate to these kind of inconceivable tools. And one of the other inspirations was the myth, the biblical story of Moses, and in which his mother puts him into a basket and seals it up and sends him down the river so that he avoids being killed by the enslaving Egyptians. And I was really drawn to this story, both because I was interested in the ways that like America has overlaid Christianity over its every surface. And so if you look at the track of the Mississippi, for instance, along its course, there are all these cities with Egyptian names. There are these historical reports of, there being a famine in a particular part of Indiana, and then the people thinking of themselves as the Israelites and trying to navigate their way out of this wilderness to paradise. And so I was really started to become interested in the ways that in one country, sort of where Black and white folks are looking at this book at this particular historical time in our formation, that like there are people who are enslavers and the folks who are enslaved, and both of them are looking at themselves as God's chosen people. And I think that was an interesting thing to reckon with and to think about. But also to know that this story would have been in the popular consciousness at the time, that the idea of floating away in a basket wouldn't seem so wild to folks who might need to free themselves. So I really started to make these baskets thinking about those stories, that particular parcel of land, and trying to return something to the past and making these things. So I made these photographs using the baskets in these landscapes to sort of start to think about how these baskets performed and what they were meant to do outside of just having them in the gallery context. There we are. And so as I started to think about them as modes of transportation, there are all these ideas about them as and their potential for camouflage started to come to mind. And as I spent more time out in nature, as opposed to just thinking about my studio pursuit as in a room making things alone, that there became these moments where I would find situations where I was like, this is the material that I'm actually making the basket with out in the wild doing what it does. And so those things really started to illuminate how to make the objects. So embedded in each of the weavings, there is a quilt pattern. In this case, the quilt pattern is called Bear Paw. And then I arranged the figures in the shape of constellations that had some sort of resonance. So in this case, Ursa Major or the bear or the Big Dipper, these two figures sort of aligned and arranged themselves and where the points of those stars would be in the sky. So thinking about these two modes of navigation, both the quilt pattern telling enslaved folks what to do and where to go, and then the stars that many of them would have followed to find their way through the world and landscape, and that people have done throughout time. I think I'm always reckoning with Christianity and what it has done to me and to people and what it provides and doesn't, and trying to crack open some of those narratives to think about where queerness, where Blackness, where how to locate oneself in and against these sort of huge systems that have like dominated our world and lives. I think We Inherit the Labyrinth is maybe my favorite work from this show because it uses this quilt pattern. One of its names is Drunkard's Path, and I love how it does not rely on the kind of squares and triangles, and has this kind of organic feel to it and these things. But I also think about it as a labyrinth, and maybe it helps me think about how Black and queer and other marginalized folks have navigated the physical landscape and maybe kind of the psychic geography of this country. And I think for me, it also pulls in, or what I've pulled in, is the myth of Ariadne, who gives the questing hero a ball of yarn to navigate safely into and out of the labyrinth on a mission to destroy the Minotaur. And for me, I think about weaving as maybe the final form of that ball of yarn, that it becomes the map. It is the way that we guide ourselves through the world. It is embedded with sort of these possible stories and narratives that sustain and help push us through. And this piece was honestly an escape ladder from the way of working I had set up, and it allowed me to think about the stars and what else they help us navigate. And I think a lot of that is our psychic and interior world as well, especially those of us who have any passing interest in astrology. So this is my star sign, Capricorn. So I think of it as also kind of a self-portrait. And I think that's my last slide. We'll flip it there.
Cool. Thank you for that, Diedrick. That was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you all. I feel like I was
Well, since you ended,
breaking,
you say what?
like powering through.
Yeah, you really powered through. I think those last set of images, your show with Lauren, I hadn't seen as many of them. So I do just want to start with do you feel, I mean, do you feel like you're becoming more explicit about the biblical references? You know, with the Moses, like I see that in pieces like in the Decadence of Silence. I read the sky in the Decadence of Silence as very biblical, like thinking about like the golds in yellow and the anointing of God and things like that. Um, but yeah, do you feel like what's that impulse to sort of reckon with Christianity?
I feel that's a great question. I mean, I think that it is a thing that I am intensely self-conscious about, and I do a lot of work to be like, don't, don't, don't do it. And then despite myself, I'll be like, oh, there it is, rearing its head. And I mean, I guess that for me, there is this, what is fraught is like growing up this way, being raised this way. I feel like I am the Bible incarnate. It is in there. I can't like extricate it, even if I wanted to. That it becomes like this source code that it's like hard not to use when it is like so deeply there. And I think for me, the hope is that I can take a lot of these stories and ideas and create space for folks to like re-understand their relationship to any number of things, whether it's Christianity or not. But I think it's what it does for me is that I can crack it open and like really look at it and start to um, ask it tough questions. Not that it can
Mhm.
talk back.
Right, right.
um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it has a way of just creeping in. As you know, my parents are preachers, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
been
yeah,
creeping up into my writing in a very big way.
yeah. And
I
I
think
think
the
it's
last,
like
Mhm.
there's this idea, like I remember every old person that I knew, every old Black person that I knew at least would be like, we're living in the last days. Like every other conversation, it's like Black people are like, the world is ending, get ready. And I feel like the last 4 years of my life, I'm like, we're living in the last days. Like I'm becoming the old Black person who's like, it's get ready, get ready. The apocalypse is now.
Yeah. No, no, I hear you. I mean, it's interesting thinking about because Jackie sort of brought up the essay, the most recent essay that I wrote for you. And I feel like, you know, like this idea of the Bible and prophecy is something that sort of crept into that, but I can kind of tell people like what that was about. So I ended up writing an essay about Diedrick's work, which actually I think is the first time that I was asked to explicitly write about your work. But thinking about this sort of idea of breath in this moment, because you know during COVID, like you know, with that being a sort of respiratory illness, you know, I was thinking a lot about breath, but also sort of having my own health experience with like having an autoimmune condition. So I was sort of worried about my own breath and was sort of having these really sort of vivid dreams um, around like George Floyd and like helicopters sort of penetrating my neck. This is a really intense thing, but when I was sort of asked to write about Diedrick's work, everything just sort of came down to this idea of breath. And you know, I started to think about like, you know, your work as sort of like this really elaborate form of allegory, sort of reminiscent of a dreamscape. Um, but you know, my 33rd birthday, which is also, you know, 33, thinking about Christ. Um, you know, I had this dream of like these helicopters penetrating my neck, which was obviously like a conjuring of George Floyd. So I had it around maybe like 5 a.m. in the morning. You know, went back to sleep, walked, you know, to the park because some friends were having, you know, cake for me in the park. And I sort of ran into this woman who I had never seen before. Mind you, this is sort of a route that I would take pretty frequently. And it was this woman who had this parrot, and like, you know, the parrot is just sort of opening up its wings for me. So I was sort of confronted with this imagery of two different forms of flight, like these sort of images of both violence and tenderness that I think is so prevalent, like in your work, Diedrick. Um, you know, and it felt like a kind of like prophecy, like I had to see like, you know, this sort of horrible part to also see the joy at the same time. Um, And so I'm curious, just like thinking about this idea of breath, because that's something that I'm writing about, but do you see that like vividly, like when you were making things like 1079, and other pieces like that, and the bandage pieces?
Yeah, I tears. Like I read a draft of Daniel's essay. It took me like 2 days because I was like, okay, I can't see anymore. I have to like put it down. But no, like you brought back so many things that I had done, and like being there, witnessing some of the kind of creation of works and dimensions that I had not thought about, which I think is like the power of great writing and criticism and all of these things. And I think because we've like developed such a shorthand, like, like Danielle can come to the studio and like it'll be like, what about green? And that'll be the whole conversation about it. And then we're like off to doing other things and like gossiping. That to see you engage with the work, I was like, oh, I've never thought about it in these terms. This is opening up new avenues of like understanding of things that I know so much about because I made them. And I think it's like reoriented me into like things that I'm making now. And I do see the kind of through lines now around like breath and breathing or not that I didn't before. And there's certainly sort of these physical relationships I have to the work or decisions that I make, and the way that figures are posed or the materiality, that I think does carry over from those original works where breath was maybe more prevalent or like literal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a through line. I think what you said something earlier, like the spirit of the work has not changed, and I think that's true. Um, I mean, it always has sort of dealt with the body. I mean, it's interesting sort of being around New York and having conversations about your work with other art curators or artists. And a lot of them, describe your work as having this sort of painterly quality, and sort of it being seductive. And I think that's all true. But I think when I was sort of approaching the essay that I wrote about your work, I was like, yes, it is seductive, it is beautiful, but it is also heavy. And I think in writing it, I needed people to understand the weight of the thing. That that there was a sort of loss of breath there with 1079, thinking about, Eric Garner and Michael Brown, I Can't Breathe, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. Like that was all sort of material, sort of woven into the fabric of those pieces. At the same time, you're creating this kind of advanced allegory where you can sort of see beyond that, like the reserved demeanor in Decadence of Silence, like it's sort of juxtaposed with that other kind of imagery.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, can you talk a little bit about your journey from abstraction to figuration and like how you sort of evoke the body or like the ways that you go about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are always for me these early moments, like where I look back now and I see the early moments of bringing the body in. I think every weaving for a while I thought of as a body, a specific one or a general one under certain circumstances. And I was adamant about calling these dedications portraits for so long, and I would get pushback from people who were like you can't call this a portrait, or like, don't you think this is a better word that like kind of captures it? And I think the moments where maybe I made the unicorn, it was like that to me was figurative in a way that I never imagined that I would work. And then I think the first figurative work that I made, I did not put in the slides, don't know why. And it was called Blue Under Night. It's this figure sort of standing almost not quite in, I don't know what this pose is called when you're like this way, kind of like, yeah, but like a little three quarters turned. I don't know. and it was sort of in this like nightscape looking out on an ocean. And I had seen Moonlight at this point like 6 times and was just like in love with how much water felt like it was a figure. It was like pouring out of the screen practically every other scene. There was a figure in a tub or at the ocean or any number of other like configurations. And I think that movie, that moment also represented for me, it was like the first moment, I think since the kind of sensationalized like real life Black death that was on television, and that like there was this cohort of like Black creatives who were making things about Black people for Black people and in many modes, like I don't know, from Moonlight to that She's Gotta Have It reboot to Wakanda coming to life. Like there were all these different ways that like Black stories were being told, and from different vantage points, and all like, you know, the people got to be the hero and the villain, and not one or the other. Like it was just becoming more complex. And I think I had a lot of these thoughts to myself where I was like, oh, I can make the work I make and put bodies in it again and know that they will be safe, and like that there's more discourse and more space that they're taking up. And I think the same was happening in contemporary art. Like there's this groundswell of figurative painters in particular, and all these folks coming out to show what Black life looked like or could look like. And it was like, oh, like there's context, there's like scaffolding, there's a way that they can be read and cared for that I don't think I felt when I was like starting to make art, that I could like depict Black people literally and not worry that people would say something wild.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I was just thinking about just the multiplicities of like readings, like, of your work. I'm thinking about um, Bittersweet, Drowned Jubilee, right? Did I get that right? Like just that particular piece is obviously related to I should know what it is. It's also related to like a story like from your hometown, that has to do with a drowning of 3 Black teenagers. They were handcuffed and transported by boat, but obviously the boat capsized and they weren't able to sort of regain their breath or come up for air. But at the same time, when you look at that image, it's like it can really be read as like, a figure like fishing or something. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way that like you look at it and you don't see, kind of all that heaviness or all that context. So it's like there's always this sort of like dual reading that happens. I mean, so can you talk about like, whether or not how your relationship to sort of these historical contexts is?
Absolutely. I feel, well, one, I feel like this is maybe a thing that a lot of artists can identify with, but I think that this is one of those pieces that has become my calling card. Like this is, I think, a work that a lot of folks have seen or know or talk about. And I think I love it, like that's fine, but it also does this thing for me where I'm like, I'll never get out from under this. I'll never make another bitter attendance drowned Jubilee,
Right.
But it is like, it brings together to me all these things that I care about. And it was one of the first moments where I really like had a means and a way to employ the catfish to talk about a historical event. So these 3 young men were drowned in police custody at a Juneteenth celebration in my hometown. And so to lose Black life on the celebration of Black liberation feels like it's hard at the hands of police as well, like not to leave that out. like, how do you talk about that or reconcile what that does to a community? And this is in 1981, so it's not even, this is still like I think a lot of the things that we talk about now still bring me back to this moment. And you were asking me a question I'm not answering yet, though. So the question was, how do I get both of these things to kind of sit in the same space?
Yeah, sit in the same space.
I think I am interested in the like idea of hope, or not rewriting history, certainly, because like this moment has passed and happened, but rethinking like what is at stake, what could happen in these kind of future worlds, and because I don't want to re-articulate the violence or the trauma. I want to figure out ways to tell those stories that allow people to sit with them, and make images that they want to engage with. I think about it maybe as kind of a sugar and a knife. Like once you get that sweet thing, then like you get the jab. And I feel like, color and texture, all these things, like, people get sort of drawn in, and then once they're there and they want to linger, maybe they will start to unpack a lot of the meaning or the wall text or the whatever. And I think that this is maybe that example of what I was saying about the catfish. So instead of showing that loss of life, the young men become these catfish, and these, the fishermen or the townsfolk who are sort of trying to rescue them. It sort of confuses this idea of life and death between, if you save a catfish, it's going to die. But I like this idea that like if they become the sustenance, there's this kind of perfect loop between our lives and theirs, and the kind of return, and that kind of it's renewing.
Right.
Yeah.
And how do you, well, can you talk more about the silhouette? Because it is your figure, essentially. But I see them as kind of everyman, like stand-ins, shadow and black race.
Absolutely. I think of them, I mean, they are my silhouette normally because I'm available. Like I'm
Right.
always there and happy to model for myself. And I think that they evolved over time to be, like, I don't think I generally think of them as self-portraiture, and unless that is explicit in the case that I was saying about the Capricorn piece. But as a vehicle for people to think about what's happening in the image, like to imagine themselves. Usually they're hung pretty low, so that when you see them, you're kind of engulfed in them. The figures are sort of at your height. So I think you get to contend with the bodies and the work, or they become mirrors. I think for some folks, like that kind of psychological space that they take up by being kind of these shadows. But for me, I do insist and think about them as less shadow and more skin. That there's kind of like this irrevocable blackness by making them black, which I owe to, Carrie James Marshall, Belkis Ion, Kara Walker, on and on and on. I think that there's a long history of Black folks articulating themselves in this way.
Absolutely. Yeah, the idea of being unequivocally Black. Yeah. And so I guess like one additional question I had is, just with the new museum show, and actually your most recent show with Lauren, can you talk about the decision to take these, off the wall and make the backs visible?
Yes.
Like, I mean, like as someone who was like frequently like in your studio, I mean, I think that was always a discussion, it's, but it's interesting to sort of go into the gallery and now have that be available to the viewer?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's I love having this conversation with CCA people also, because I think so much of it, like I owe to the way that grad school is structured. Like, you know, people can drop by anytime, whether they're your classmates or like people are always in your studio, especially when you're making weaving at every state that the weaving finds itself in. Whereas I think, you know, you can go away and make a photo or whatever. So like people would come and I would be, you know, rapidly trying to address some of the like skill or technical things. And someone's like, oh, I love that, like that hanging thread or that whatever. And I'm like, this is not done. And I think I went to an undergraduate program where we were really like taught and asked to think a lot about process and finishing and craft, like really exerting a sort of mastery over and asking questions about the edges, the back. And I think there were so many critiques that I had to sit in where before we ever addressed what the thing was about, we had to spend 15 minutes like looking at it and expecting it and asking ourselves if it was impeccable. And I don't think I was ever that student. And I finally came to this place where I had permission and encouragement to kind of break those boundaries. And so I think something about showing the backs and having these uneven tassels or lack of tassels or things kind of spurting out. Like I do owe to Mr. Sloppy Craft and you know, my cohort and all these people who I think also were just like, I don't understand textiles, but I understand like what this thing is doing or like how it's working on me, what happens when I start to see things unraveling or seemingly in a state of sort of like coming undone and all of these things that I think I would not have considered or would have kind of kept questing for a different sort of mastery that now I think I'm very interested in unpacking and disrupting. And I think showing the backs and all of these things start to invite people in ways that I think we as textile makers like don't often. And we work in this discipline that is so much about tactility and touch and all of these things, but then we try to erase all of those markers at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think we have to open it up for questions now.
I love you, Danielle.
Love you too. Thank you.
I need to figure out how to stop this.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Diedrick, I loved seeing all your work like this and hearing you speak about it. And the textiles are just gorgeous, and seeing, you know, the move from abstraction to figuration. And then when I saw those baskets, it just kind of took my breath away because it's like, as a sculptor, to me, it's a different kind of figuration. And I'm just really dying to hear you talk more about them, because it was kind of a surprise, like, wow, there they are standing, and you know, they're the body, they're the absence of the body, they're a shell, they're the thing that would protect one in the narrative, let's say, from drowning or from whatever evil forces might be there. They're, you know, they're woven. There, so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that process and how you're feeling about it as a weaver, and take it away, whatever you want to talk about. Just
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I feel like I'm making myself sound anxious, and maybe I am, it's fine. Developed an anxiety about becoming a weaver now. Like, I remember these moments where I was like, I'm a weaver and that's what I'm gonna do, that's who I am. And now I think I've gotten to this place where I'm like, ooh, I have all these other ideas and modes I wanna work in, and I don't wanna wait too long. And then people are like, what is going, like, you're shaking the table. And so I've been thinking so long about bringing baskets into my work. I've had many opportunities and I always balk right at the end. And I feel like all of this time over the last year of trying to like figure out my relationship to so many things, I was just like, okay, do it, like just do it. And as I was making them and thinking through the ideas, I really was struck by like how much for me these sculptures, and to a great extent weaving itself, is performative. And I think the thing that I'm always questing for, and I think it's lost in the exhibition space, is the dimensionality and the ways that like the processes do lend so much. And I don't want to like be the person who drags a loom into the gallery. So I was like, how do you reanimate these things, and how do you share this kind of performative spirit? And so I think that those photographs really became a way to help the baskets understand themselves and like what they were, what their role is, and that they aren't just these static things, although they're presented this way here. And I really like working that way. There's something about making three-dimensional things that I think I like move my body differently. The the way they have to make meaning feels different. And I think because uh, at this moment, the way that the story or the narrative is shaped around my woven work is sort of out of my hands. Even if I make things that talk about new things, I think that the work has already built its own sort of like way of talking about itself. That I think that there's so much room still in photography and sculpture and any number of other modes where I can sort of start to set new ground and like establish new ways of understanding the work. And I think all of that is really exciting. I don't know if I said enough about them, but
I have a question for you. When did you what happened to you to awaken your Blackness? You know, because as Black folks, specifically in all white institutions, you're gonna be born again, and sometimes, you know, something happens to you where you become conscious and you realize to include the narrative of, you know, of Black is one of your labels. What happened to you?
I like that framing. I'm like, I don't know if I would have thought of it that way. I mean, I think that like going away to school in the first place, like to undergrad, it was like how it's like it cracked a lot of things, right? Like being away from my family, being away from these organizing forces that just like where everything around me was already Black, like going to this space where like it wasn't, even though like I'd lived in a world and navigated like being around white folks, it was not in the same way that I think you do in school. And so I think it was almost like learning on a different level of like having an inside and outside conversation, and then being like, oh, I can't keep this all internal. Like I want to make work about these things, or these are like my points of view, and they're going to become external. And I think at first there weren't a lot of people who knew how to help. Like if I was like, you know, I don't know when in undergrad first like had someone talk with me about a living Black person who was making art. And so I think a lot of that research at first you're like doing on your own and trying to figure out what your relationship is to those things. And I don't think at a certain point I had the consciousness to understand microaggressions, for instance, or like certain things that now I'm like, oh, here we are. But yeah, I don't know what helped. I think a lot of research, a lot of spending time with like creating a community that I could spend time with and test things out on and ask questions about. And I remember having a professor, and maybe many at this point, who would say this thing that I think I still believe in, like oh, like if you can make something that like an art world and like your grandma would like, then maybe you're like making something good. And I think I've gotten to a place where I like leaned really hard into the grandma thing, and I'm glad that it still works for other people. Yeah, but I think I want to always be legible to the people who look like me.
I have a question for Daniela also. So Daniela, the two of you met at CCA, and then you went off to the world to do your work independently, and then you have these friendships. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us what's it like being inside institutions now that perhaps you didn't expect, or do you feel there's a space for you to be able to carve out your own writing and your own interest in the museum, Daniela?
That's a good question. Let's figure out how to start. I think my relationship with institutions is an interesting one in the sense that when I actually left CCA, I didn't want to be in a major institution at all. I actually wanted to be in a more alternative space, which are spaces that I do think give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of doing exactly what you want to do. Um, but I wrote my thesis on the choreographer Ralph Lemon, and MoMA kind of sort of got wind of that and wanted me to come and work on a book. So it's I sort of let my research sort of lead me to the institution in a way. It sort of made sense. It was a opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about Ralph because my thesis was so focused. It was focused on one particular work that he did in 2004, I think. Whereas like I came to MoMA sort of for an opportunity to sort of think about his career, like for his 40-year career, the span of his career. But I think I've made a lot of good connection at the moment. I think there are opportunities for me to carve out space. Like I do outside writing, for example, the essay for Diedrick. With all the shows I work on, I get sort of essays in the catalog, and that's sort of a top priority for me, where I can sort of think about like some of my research, even if the main show I might be working on for MoMA, it's not exactly like an artist of my choosing, so I think there are always ways to sort of carve out, different windows for you to do what you need to do. When I was sort of at the Walker, I edited a thing called the Living Collections Catalog, and that was I fully edited that, and that was sort of me thinking about Black experimental music, like through like 5 different figures, and really trying to think about really like what kind of were the spiritual and intellectual philosophies of that, like Cecil Taylor, Anthony Braxton, all have these like deep spiritual philosophies that go along with the sound. So I was really able to sort of craft and shape that. I think in institutions, it's like you just sort of have to find, get in where you fit in and like find a way, to keep your interests like afloat. And there are different ways to do that, whether through programming. For the Popel show that I worked on, I had a full program series where I worked with artists that I wanted to work with. If that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem.
I think Jackie had a question.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I was just thinking a lot about the work that, of course, I saw when you were here at CCA, Diedrick, and to some extent, Danielle's work as well. First to both of you, I don't think of it as abstraction. I thought about your early work as conceptual art. To me, the broom as a surrogate is about the idea of the materiality of that thing. And I've just written down some other things I thought about. The figures in the weavings are, of course, indexical, and they're mimetic and they're realistic and they're gestural. And so they make us think of real bodies. But I think there's something also going on in your work that's about the idea of craft forward practices. It's about the idea of a kind of Carrie James Marshall or a Kara Walker kind of fine art that's wedded to a kind of idea of vernacular art coming out of Black art fairs or the Black romantic, the things that our non-specialist parents might have had in their Black American homes. So to me, a lot of your work is about the idea of things, and in that way is conceptual.
Love that. Yeah. I think that for sure, like the sort of artistic parents and like grandparents in some cases really have shaped how I've thought about art and what I wanted to do. And I think even if I like reach back to Aaron Douglas, like there are these folks who like I think made images that found me before I knew who made them, right? Like, so I remember seeing some of these images in the places and spaces where I have grown up and like come to understand myself, and then like what the possible aesthetics that those things could take. And so I think I've always kind of returned back to these wells to sort of then like put something back. And I know then if I put these two things in combination, like people can read those things, like that's legible in a way that like kind of goes beyond the language components, although like, I'm a student of language, love these things. Yeah, like that there is something about that conjuring or reconjuring those like inputs.
I mean, I saw it in Danielle's thesis as she was writing it too, writing about, this really tough work that Ralph Lemon was doing. And I would ask her, like, what is going on here? and she kind of would say, just relax, and let it wash over you. And I finally got that. There's a guy walking down a country road with like an astronaut helmet on. And I'm like, what is this guy doing?
You're like, I don't get it. I was like, I'm going to make you get it. It's like, don't worry, we'll get there. Yeah, it is a lot of that. It's a lot of layering, a lot of layers but it is conceptual. I believe you're right. For sure. But it's layered, heavy work. And I will say that the essay that I wrote for Diedrick, and I'll share it when I can, it's not quite published yet, is sort of in the same vein of the Ralph writing, in that when I'm thinking about work that is deeply conceptual, I do rely heavily on description to sort of get you through that. And I like take you through it in a very particular way. It's the kind of show, not tell model almost. For sure.
And
Thank you,
I have a question for Diedrick also. Diedrick, the history of textiles in the U.S. has been such a contested territory in terms of like not enough voices in the books and the museums and the exhibitions, and you seem to be on a crest. And do you think that this is a time where textiles and the voices that are represented are going to explode into a lot of other areas?
I think so. I mean, the hopeful and generous answer is yes, of course. But I think that there are, I was reading, what's it called? Feminist politicization today. I feel like I felt like I was in grad school again. I was reading it, and there's this passage about Faith Ringgold, and it was surreal in the sense that like a lot of the things that she's talking about leveraging in the essay really still feel true. But then there's this other like glut of things where I'm like, oh, like that's falling away, or I know I can point to and think about makers in the field who have kind of taken up this space, and that it is changing, and that like beyond being like, you know, at the height of the fiber world, that these folks are like finding themselves in the contemporary art sphere, and that there's scaffolding. I keep using that word, I don't know why, there now that I don't think was there before. And if I think about folks like a Faith Ringgold, like this person whose politics, whose and identities are so much a part of the work and its trajectory and reception. It feels like we can talk about those things in our work now in a way that we're not battling to get people to think about and understand. So that for that I'm grateful, and I think grateful for like where we go as a field and medium.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there any more questions?
I have a question. I really liked how you were talking about living in California and when you said what wine should and shouldn't taste like. And I was wondering what moving to California did for your concepts and work compared to what you were thinking about before ever living in California.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I moved to California when I was 20. Oh God, I think I was 23. And I say to this day, like I came of age in California. Like I came of age in San Francisco, which is a amazing place to do such a thing. And I mean, I was like this little country suburban child from Texas, and had never lived in a large city in my life. So there were all these things about living alongside people and being with people out in the world all day, like that I hadn't experienced. And and I think it cracked open a lot of things in my worldview, that like, you know, I had never seen, for instance, the homeless crisis up close in the way that you do in San Francisco. So I think just a lot of the ways I was thinking about things and the issues that I cared about, and seeing them in a pressure cooker like San Francisco was unreal. And I'm a military brat, so like there were these ways that I thought like I was worldly and I'd seen a lot, and then I was like, no, I've never seen anything apparently. And I think like also like the kind of queer culture that was in San Francisco, the collaborative spirit, the ways that like I was invited to be in shows and in conversations with my peers, as well as folks who I thought of as like, you know, the folks in charge, like both those who were my faculty or like successful artists who had these careers that I think like growing up in the South, like there was this way that you defer to the people who are above you. And like, I felt like that all got dismantled when I moved to San Francisco. I don't know if I answered your full question.
No, that was a really good answer. It helped me.
But yeah, I think that it completely changed my what was possible.
Totally.
We'd like to end this session. If there's one more burning question. Okay, as TT always has trained us, could everybody unmute themselves and give Diedrick and Daniela who are here from our hearts, a thank you for coming to CCA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was so wonderful. Great to see you both.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Guys,
on your
Tina.
wonderful
Thank you.
success. We're so proud of you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for
Congratulations.
inviting us.
Yeah, this is great.
Good night, and everybody on to the future. Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you, everybody.